Something very serious is approaching America, and it is not a single storm or one crisis that we can easily name. It is a convergence of dangers, economic, political, environmental, and social, that together form a threat greater than the sum of their parts. We are a nation standing at the edge of a precipice where every crack in our democracy, every fracture in our society, and every truth we fail to face brings us closer to a breaking point. The question before us is not whether challenges exist, they do, and they are immense, but whether we will have the wisdom and courage to confront them before they overwhelm us. The fragile state of American democracy is one of the most pressing realities that the nation faces today, and its deterioration is not an isolated phenomenon, but a product of multiple interacting forces that have been building over decades. At the heart of the issue lies a political system increasingly paralyzed by division, where compromise has become nearly impossible, and the ability to govern effectively is eroding. Partisan polarization has reached historic levels, with citizens split into ideological camps that no longer see each other as fellow Americans, but as existential threats. This breakdown in unity has weakened the trust that people once had in their institutions, from Congress and the presidency to the courts and even the electoral system itself. Elections, once regarded as the peaceful mechanism of transition, are now sources of anger, suspicion, and even violence, which reflects the dangerous fragility of the democratic fabric. The dominance of money in politics has only deepened this crisis. Corporations, special interest groups, and wealthy elites exert disproportionate influence over policy making, leaving ordinary citizens with the growing belief that their voices do not matter. This erodes not just trust, but also participation, creating a cycle in which political power is concentrated in fewer hands while public disillusionment spreads. Democracy cannot survive when the majority feels systematically excluded, and this sense of exclusion is already manifesting in widespread cynicism, voter apathy, and in some cases, the turn toward extremism. The hollowing out of faith in fair governance is a silent but dangerous precursor to instability, as history repeatedly shows that nations fractured from within often fall before any external enemy can strike. The role of disinformation in deepening the cracks cannot be underestimated either. When citizens can no longer agree on basic facts, democracy loses its foundation, which depends on debate, compromise, and evidence-based decision-making. Instead, political dialogue is replaced by conspiracy, hostility, and suspicion, tearing apart the social cohesion necessary for collective problem-solving. In this environment, leaders exploit division rather than healing it, fueling a spiral of anger that undermines the very principles the nation was founded upon. The institutions that once served as guardians of democracy are under strain, and their ability to withstand continuous attacks is in doubt. Without urgent reform and a return to shared values of truth, fairness, and accountability, the fragile state of democracy in the United States will remain a looming threat that could explode under the pressure of the next national crisis. The economic trap of inequality and unsustainable debt is pushing the United States toward a dangerous precipice, and it is a crisis that touches nearly every dimension of society. At the top of the economic ladder, a small elite controls unprecedented levels of wealth, while millions of Americans at the bottom struggle to make ends meet. This vast divide is not simply a matter of numbers, but of social stability. For history shows that no democracy can endure indefinitely when inequality reaches such extremes. Wages for the majority of workers have stagnated for decades, even as productivity has soared, meaning that the benefits of economic growth have flowed overwhelmingly to the wealthiest households. Families are working longer hours, taking multiple jobs, and still finding it impossible to cover basic expenses like healthcare, housing, and education. This is not an economic accident, but the result of policies and structures that favor capital over labor, financial speculation over productive investment, and tax loopholes that reward wealth accumulation while penalizing wage earners. Debt adds another layer of fragility to this system. Household debt in the form of credit cards, student loans, and mortgages has reached record levels, leaving millions vulnerable to sudden shocks such as job loss, medical emergencies, or rising interest rates. Corporate debt has ballooned as well, much of it tied to risky practices like stock buybacks rather than investment in innovation or worker wages. At the national level, the government's debt has crossed unprecedented thresholds, creating fears not just of fiscal instability, but of the political consequences when austerity measures are inevitably introduced. The reliance on borrowing to sustain consumption has created an illusion of prosperity, but beneath that illusion lies the reality of a society living on borrowed time. The most alarming aspect of this trap is that inequality and debt reinforce each other. As wealth concentrates at the top, the majority are forced to borrow just to maintain their standard of living, further enriching the financial elite who profit from lending. This cycle deepens resentment and erodes faith in the fairness of the system, fueling the sense that opportunity in America is no longer real. Economic power translates into political power, meaning reforms that could correct the imbalance are blocked by those who benefit from it most. Without structural changes, the trap will tighten until it sparks widespread unrest, as citizens facing hopelessness and debt burdens begin to challenge not only policies, but the very legitimacy of the economic system itself. The climate and environmental crisis confronting the United States is no longer a matter of theoretical warnings or distant scientific predictions. It has become a lived reality that is reshaping the lives of millions. The nation has witnessed wildfires consuming entire towns, hurricanes of unprecedented intensity, devastating coastal regions, droughts crippling agricultural heartlands, and floods displacing communities that never imagined they would be underwater. These events are not isolated natural disasters, but interconnected signals of a broader system in distress, driven by human activity and sustained by decades of inaction. Each year, billions of dollars are lost to damages, and entire industries, from farming to insurance, face escalating instability. Yet what makes the crisis particularly dangerous is not only the destruction it causes, but the speed at which it is accelerating, outpacing the capacity of infrastructure, governance, and society to adapt. The economic costs of this crisis extend far beyond repair and relief efforts. Climate change threatens to undermine the long-term viability of key sectors such as energy, real estate, and agriculture. Rising sea levels place trillions of dollars of property at risk, while prolonged droughts jeopardize food security in regions once considered safe from scarcity. Energy systems, still heavily reliant on fossil fuels, face both physical vulnerabilities from extreme weather and moral pressures to decarbonize rapidly. The transition to sustainable energy has begun but remains uneven, often obstructed by political resistance, corporate lobbying, and short-term economic interests. The United States, once a leader in scientific innovation, risks falling behind in the global race for green technology, allowing competitors to dominate the industries that will define the future economy. Social consequences are equally severe as the burden of climate change falls disproportionately on vulnerable communities. Poorer populations, minority neighborhoods, and rural towns often bear the brunt of environmental hazards while having the least resources to recover. Displacement caused by floods, fires, and storms creates climate refugees within the nation's own borders, straining local governments and fueling tensions over resources and housing. This environmental injustice is a threat not only to public health and stability, but to the very notion of equality, exposing deep fractures in the American promise of fairness and opportunity. The longer decisive action is delayed, the greater the human suffering will be, and the more irreversible the damage to ecosystems that sustain life. The climate crisis is therefore not only an environmental challenge, but a fundamental test of whether the United States can mobilize collective will, scientific capacity, and political courage to preserve its future in the face of an unfolding catastrophe. The risk of global conflict and the declining influence of the United States is a threat that cannot be underestimated, for it sits at the intersection of foreign policy, national security, and the shifting balance of global power. For decades, the United States relied on its military strength to project dominance and maintain influence across the world, believing that hard power alone could secure its leadership. Yet today, that reliance is backfiring as rivals such as China and Russia grow increasingly assertive, while many allies grow weary of a strategy that prioritizes confrontation over cooperation. The international system is moving toward multipolarity, with rising economies and regional powers no longer willing to submit to a U.S.-centered order. This erosion of influence is particularly dangerous because it coincides with heightened global tensions, where even a small miscalculation could trigger escalation into conflicts of catastrophic proportions. The U.S. has placed itself in a position where diplomacy is often subordinated to military action. From protracted wars in the Middle East to rising tensions in Eastern Europe and the South China Sea, the pattern has been one of intervention and escalation rather than reconciliation. This has drained resources at home, cost countless lives, and created a perception globally that America seeks domination rather than partnership. In contrast, competitors are increasingly leveraging economic statecraft, technology, and diplomacy to build spheres of influence, leaving the U.S. looking reactive rather than proactive. The result is a narrowing window for the United States to maintain a leadership role based on collaboration rather than coercion. Compounding this challenge is the growing possibility of direct confrontation between major powers. U.S. sanctions, military alliances, and forward deployments create flashpoints that risk spiraling into open conflict. The war in Ukraine has already reignited Cold War dynamics, while tensions over Taiwan and the South China Sea present the most serious risks of military escalation in decades. Nuclear deterrence remains a factor, but the assumption that it alone can prevent great power war is dangerously complacent. The proliferation of cyber warfare, hypersonic weapons, and advanced technologies means that conflict could emerge in unexpected and uncontrollable ways. At home, this global posture comes at a heavy price. The costs of maintaining vast military commitments drain resources needed for domestic priorities, while endless wars and interventions erode public trust in foreign policy. Citizens increasingly question why billions are spent abroad while inequality, infrastructure decay, and environmental crises deepen at home. The danger is that the United States may find itself overextended, facing simultaneous pressures from abroad and discontent within, unable to manage either effectively. If the nation does not redefine its role in the world, moving from dominance to constructive cooperation, it risks entering a cycle of perpetual conflict that will accelerate its decline rather than secure its future. The social and cultural breakdown unfolding in the United States represents one of the gravest internal challenges to its stability and resilience, for no nation can thrive externally when it is unraveling from within. Across the country, rising violence in cities, mass shootings in schools and public spaces, and deepening divisions between communities reflect a society struggling to maintain cohesion. At the same time, the epidemic of drug addiction, particularly the devastation wrought by opioids and fentanyl, has claimed hundreds of thousands of lives and left countless families shattered. This crisis has not only eroded public health, but has hollowed out entire communities, leaving behind economic stagnation, broken households, and a sense of hopelessness that transcends generations. When these realities are combined with rising mental health disorders, depression, and suicide rates, They reveal a society in profound distress, where individuals increasingly feel abandoned by the systems meant to protect them. The collapse of community life further magnifies these fractures. Traditional sources of social solidarity, such as local associations, religious congregations, civic groups, and neighborhood networks, have weakened dramatically. The bonds that once tied individuals to one another in shared responsibility and mutual trust have been replaced by isolation and mistrust. Social media, while connecting people digitally, has in many ways intensified this loneliness, replacing genuine relationships with superficial interactions and fueling polarization by locking individuals into ideological echo chambers. This disconnection fosters alienation, and alienation in turn creates fertile ground for radicalization, resentment, and social unrest. A fractured society is far more vulnerable to manipulation, whether from domestic demagogues who exploit grievances for political gain or from foreign actors who use disinformation to deepen divisions. Economic insecurity also plays a major role in this breakdown, as millions of Americans live with the constant fear of losing jobs, healthcare, or housing. The pressure of daily survival diminishes trust in institutions and in each other, pushing individuals to retreat into smaller identities of tribe, race, or ideology rather than embracing a broader national unity. When citizens begin to see those outside their group not as neighbors but as threats, the social fabric unravels. Schools, workplaces, and public spaces, instead of being unifying environments, become arenas of conflict and suspicion. This erosion of social cohesion undermines the nation's capacity to respond collectively to crises, whether they are economic, environmental, or geopolitical in nature. At its core, the cultural breakdown is a crisis of meaning and identity. A society that loses its shared narratives and values becomes increasingly incapable of solidarity. The American ideal of community, opportunity, and common purpose is being overshadowed by division, materialism, and distrust. Unless there is a conscious effort to rebuild these bonds, to restore a sense of belonging and shared responsibility, the nation risks sliding into a fragmentation from which recovery will be far more difficult than addressing any single external threat. The crisis of truth and information in the United States is one of the most profound challenges of the modern era, for without a shared foundation of facts, democracy and collective action become impossible. The rise of misinformation and disinformation has created a landscape in which citizens are no longer guided by common realities, but by fragmented narratives shaped by ideology, manipulation, or profit. Social media platforms, while enabling free expression, have also become engines for the rapid spread of falsehoods, amplifying conspiracy theories and divisive content, because outrage and sensationalism attract more attention than sober analysis. The algorithms that shape online discourse are designed to reward engagement, not accuracy, which means lies often travel faster and further than truth. In this environment, the line between fact and opinion has blurred, and the shared trust necessary for civil discourse is collapsing. The decline of reliable journalism has compounded the problem. Traditional news organizations, once pillars of accountability, have been weakened by financial pressures, political attacks, and the fragmentation of audiences. Many communities are now news deserts, lacking local reporting altogether, leaving citizens vulnerable to misinformation or partisan national media that frame events through narrow ideological lenses. The loss of trusted, fact-based journalism has created a vacuum filled by propagandists, influencers, and interest-driven actors who tailor narratives to confirm biases rather than to inform. This has left citizens not only misinformed, but also deeply divided, as different groups live in parallel realities where basic facts about elections, public health, or climate change are contested rather than accepted. The consequences of this breakdown are severe. When citizens cannot agree on truth, they cannot engage in meaningful debate or compromise, for each side sees the other not merely as an opponent, but as delusional or malicious. This erodes the foundation of democracy, which relies on reasoned dialogue and evidence-based decision-making. It also opens the door to authoritarian tendencies, as leaders exploit confusion and division by presenting themselves as the sole source of truth, demanding loyalty over verification. The crisis of information thus becomes a crisis of power, where manipulation replaces accountability and propaganda replaces persuasion. Foreign adversaries have also recognized this vulnerability and exploit it through cyber operations and influence campaigns designed to sow chaos. By amplifying existing divisions and spreading disinformation, they weaken American unity from within, achieving through manipulation what might once have required military confrontation. At the same time, domestic actors, from corporations to political movements, weaponize disinformation for profit or advantage, further corroding trust. The result is a nation where truth itself is contested terrain, and without truth, the possibility of collective problem-solving disintegrates. This crisis is not merely about media or technology. It is about the survival of a society's ability to function, for a nation that cannot distinguish fact from fiction is a nation unprepared to face any of the serious challenges that lie ahead. If America does not confront these converging crises with unity and truth, then something very serious will not only strike the nation, it will define its downfall.